Section 4. And so, let's act. Now, gentlemen, let's start retracing our steps. We began by looking at the actual scoreboard of the communist advance, and by seeing clearly, I hope, how very far that advance has already gone, and how imminent and horrible is the danger of the physical enslavement of the whole world, including ourselves. We then went on to the two basic and related underlying problems and dangers which threaten us more slowly, but with results which would be just as fatal. We come now to the question of what is to be done about these problems. Because we should take first things first, and the communist threat certainly has priority as a danger to be faced, we are going to discuss, probably for the rest of this afternoon, a proposed action program against the communist conspiracy. And so that you will not think I am entirely crazy, let me point out my awareness of the fact that some parts of this program would require resources and organization utterly beyond anything now available to us. Raising such resources and building such organization is not only a necessary part of the program itself, but certainly one of the most difficult. Do not think, on the one hand, that I have some magic wand for bringing such resources and organization into existence, nor, on the other, that the job has simply been ignored. We have to be realists in this war, or we are wasting our time, and a realist does not run away from parts of a problem or close his eyes to them because they are the most difficult parts. So we'll come to that subject in due course with the results of at least a lot of thought that has been given to it. But we can't cover everything at once. I hope, therefore, that you will be willing simply to put to one side temporarily this question of where resources and organization would come from, while we consider strategy and tactics for the fight itself. Now, the very first thing we must realize is that there is no easy formula possible, nor brilliant scheme devisable for beating the communists. Communism is not like a poison to which you simply find the antidote. Its present power and extensiveness has not been created by some grand formula that swept the world, but by the sum total, by integration in the mathematical sense, of an almost infinite number of details done well from the communist point of view. There has been brilliant control and coordination by central authority of the efforts of millions of men who have been brought, by one means or another, to dedicate themselves body and soul to separate tiny pieces of the job. As a result of this 40 years of cumulative effort, the conspiracy is now incredibly well organized. It is so well financed that it has billions of dollars annually just to spend on propaganda. It has the benefit of decades of successful experience. It has one set goal of world rule by any means, to which every act and all of the lives of some 40 million party members are now wholly subservient. And it is guided by men who had to have supreme cunning and ruthlessness to have achieved their present positions within the conspiracy itself. This octopus is so large that its tentacles now reach into all of the legislative halls, all of the union labor meetings, a majority of the religious gatherings, and most of the schools of the whole world. It has a central nervous system which can make its tentacles in the labor unions of Bolivia, in the farmers' cooperatives of Saskatchewan, in the caucuses of the Social Democrats of West Germany, and in the classrooms of the Yale Law School, all retract or reach forward simultaneously. It can make all of these creeping tentacles turn either right or left, or a given percentage turn right while the others turn left at the same time, in accordance with the intentions of a central brain in Moscow or Ust-Kamenogorsk. The human race has never before faced any such monster of power which was determined to enslave it. There is certainly no reason for underrating its size, its efficiency, its determination, its power, or its menace. But there is one basic consideration of tremendous importance which we must keep always in mind. This is that communism has been imposed and must always be imposed from the top down by trickery and terror, and that it must then be maintained by terror. In other words, at least 95% of all the human beings on both sides of the Iron Curtain do not want communism. The job is not to unsell a majority from something they want or think is good for them, but to enable a preponderant majority to resist and refuse something they do not want. Truth, reality, human instinct, and the overwhelming weight of human desire are on our side. We have these points in our favor against a conspiracy which must depend on falsehood, cunning, and terror utilized by less than 5% of the total population. To feel that we cannot win that struggle is a form of pessimism to which I, for one, shall never yield. In fact, I know from compulsions of human behavior which history makes clear that the human race will throw off this tyranny, just as surely as the Greek world led by Athens threw off a very similar tyranny imposed by fascist Sparta, or as the French people, in a much more minute parallel, put an end to the reign of terror which was the climax of the French Revolution. The question is when? How far and how long will the communist conspiracy keep moving forward successfully before it is overthrown and scattered to the winds of history? How deeply and irrevocably will we have been infected and ravaged by the disease of collectivism, in the poisoned air of which communism thrives, before the ghouls have been routed? How much of the free world can still be saved from the horror of the communist seizures? Or, and this is entirely likely, gentlemen, even if the conspirators reach a precarious moment when they seem to have the whole world in their grip, how soon thereafter can the thin shell of terroristic power be blown to bits, and how much of our civilization saved from damage beyond repair? These questions do not lead to defeatism, nor do they lead to optimism, except of a long-range, patient, and most resolute variety. But they do lead to a realization that this war against the communist tyranny not only must go on, but will go on, with us or without us, until that tyranny is finally overthrown. The socialist ideology may eventually destroy our whole civilization through erosion and stagnation, though I think even that can and will be prevented. But the criminal activists headed by the gangsters in the Kremlin will not survive to survey the damage they have done. Of all the examples of the, quote, big lie, unquote, which the communists have told to forward their purposes, the biggest is the lie by Khrushchev that history is on their side. Exactly the opposite is true. We have here a so far highly successful attempt of cunning power-seeking murderers using a fraudulent ideology as a cover and excuse for their crimes to impose a most brutal form of slavery on the whole world. And this development is so contrary to the recurrent trends of sociology, is such a rare exception to the halting but general movement from savagery towards civilization, that only twice in all recorded history has there been anything like it. One was the drive of the Lycurgian fascists, headed by Sparta. The second is the drive of the Marxian communists, headed by Soviet Russia. Neither is anything more, when viewed in long perspective, than a dirty boil on the surface of history. But a bad boil is not only extremely painful while it lasts, it can become dangerous and damaging if not lanced in time. The question is how soon the strength and the determination can be gathered to pierce this festering boil. What I have chiefly intended the questions above and this brief introduction to lead to, therefore, is the realization that we are not tossing a coin which either comes down win or lose, that every effort we undertake, every battle we fight, even if we lose it, and every sacrifice we make is cumulative. Every bit of dedication to the cause is worthwhile. The most important consideration is to get the most possible effectiveness out of all efforts, all sacrifice, and all dedication, so as to speed the day when the cumulative total of anti-communist resistance finally overcomes their always overextended framework of their control. Obviously, the place for us to begin is in the United States for two reasons. First, because it must be our more earnest hope and goal to break out of this straitjacket, woven of pretense, deception, audacity, and terror, before it completely encompasses ourselves. and second, because the American support of the international communist conspiracy is now the backbone of its strength and has been for many years. If and when we can reach the point of turning just the American government from actively helping the communist conspiracy everywhere in the world, we shall have won a most important battle in the war ahead. For this purpose, we need to do everything we can which will directly affect the actions and decisions of the men in government, to enlighten and slow down those on the other side. But the one ultimately sure way of achieving this reversal is to awaken enough local leaders among an apathetic American people, before the continuous brainwashing by the left makes it impossible, to the point of generating public pressures that will force the slowdown and reversal. The amount of work required to do that in the face of the way the cards have been so painstakingly stacked against us is something to contemplate. And yet there is nothing but work and more work, thinking and more thinking, dedication and more dedication, which will do the job. So now let's look at the job itself. If I were the, quote, man on the white horse, unquote, on our side in this war, which is still political and educational rather than military, if I had sufficient resources available and sufficiently accepted authority over 1 million dedicated supporters, out of at least 5 times that many militant anti-communists who are already enrolled in or contributing to hundreds of ineffectual, quote, freedom, unquote, groups, so that I could coordinate the activities of those million men and women with some degree of positiveness and efficiency, approaching the coordination by the communists of their members and fellow travelers. If, though recognized as the leader for the sake of positiveness of direction and coordination of effort and resources, I still had the dedicated advice, counsel, help, organizing ability, and executive know-how offered by the ablest men in America among the staunch anti-communists whom I could gather around me. If I had this kind of realistic force with which to fight the communists, here are some of the things I would do. 1. First, we would establish reading rooms, somewhat similar to the Christian Science reading rooms, but small and inexpensive in just as many of the cities, towns, and villages of this country as we could, just as rapidly as we could. They would be manned, utilized, and promoted in every feasible way by volunteers who were local members of our organization. The space would either be contributed or would be obtained at a very low rental. And there are men and women, including young men and young women, in every community in America today who are just looking for some way like this within their circumstances to help our cause. Some of them do not really mean the question, what can I do? But many of them mean it with all their hearts, and they are the very ones we would have in our fold. These reading rooms would serve as rental libraries also, but with very strict rules and limitations on the taking out of books so as to avoid too much loss through communist sabotage. They would be extremely selective instead of exhaustive as to the books available. And in this connection, let me point out that the January 1959 issue of American Opinion will be given over entirely to a listing under the heading of Old Books and New Reviews of 100 books, with just 1 or 2 review paragraphs about each. Our introduction will state that for any good American who really wants to know the true history of events and developments of the past 2 decades, these books alone, or even a majority of them, will constitute a complete education in that field, which they will. I can name for you today, out of people whom I had never heard of in 1952, convert after convert to the anti-communist crusade, and now among the most indefatigable workers in that crusade, who were aroused and became converts after first reading May God Forgive Us, by then determinedly obtaining and reading all or most of some 50 books which I listed in the back of that one. So I know there is a need for such a pamphlet as the January issue of American Opinion, and that it can do some good. But the reason I brought that matter up here is that those 100 books, so far as they are available, will be the nucleus of the stock of these reading rooms. And since communist pressures have caused the original publishers to allow so many of these valuable books of true history to go out of print, after first small editions, I am delighted to be able to tell you that a good friend of mine, Lyle Munson of the Bookmailer, already has the little company founded and the physical arrangements made for bringing any and all of these books, for which there is any reasonable demand, back into print in inexpensive editions. He has, in fact, already put out Major Jordan's diaries, which had been out of print and almost impossible to obtain, in a $2 edition. He can and will do the same for Arthur Bliss Lane's I Saw Poland Betrayed, for George Creel's Russia's Race for Asia, and many others if and when we or anybody else need them in any reasonable quantity. We would have these 100 books, or most of them, and others in these reading rooms. We would, of course, have all of the best anti-communist periodicals there. And we would see that plenty of proselytizing fervor was shown in getting people to read both the books and the periodicals. There are countless enthusiasts in our cause today, deeply patriotic and deeply disturbed, but frustrated by not knowing what to do, who would welcome such ammunition and direction. How many books each of these reading rooms would have, especially which books, and under what arrangements, would of course have to be tightly controlled from headquarters. 2. Second, since getting the truth about both recent history and current events into as many hands and heads as possible is so important, we would see that the circulation of the conservative periodicals was expanded as rapidly as it could be done without too much waste. Now, this is not an effort to promote the magazine American Opinion, except as such concern is purely incidental and necessary to the whole presentation. We do think we have an increasingly professional magazine which will gradually appeal to a much larger audience. In American Opinion, we tried to avoid eggheadism and lay it out straight as to both news and opinions, so that he who runs may both read and understand. We believe it can do an increasingly effective job for the anti-communist cause because of the tremendous amount of work put into having its pages present a true picture of what is happening, and because American Opinion is designed to reach and appeal to the ordinary American instead of any special group. But what we are talking about here is the importance of obtaining a much wider readership for all of the worthwhile conservative publications, of which American Opinion is only one. All of them should be in those reading rooms mentioned above. I believe that in most cases the subscriptions could be handled by and the money for the purpose obtained by the local volunteer groups running those reading rooms. But there are many other fertile fields which should be sowed. For instance, I think that National Review, especially because it is aimed so professionally at the academic mind, should be in every college library in the United States, and if possible, in every fraternity house. I think that the Dan Smoot Report, because it is fairly short and is quite suitable to pick up for reading during 15 minutes of waiting time, should be in just as many doctors' and dentists' offices as possible. And while the American Medical Association has now been, quote, took, unquote, to the extent that we could not count on any direct help there, the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons, still under aggressively anti-socialist leadership, has 15,000 members, most of whom are not only highly respected leaders in their professions, but are also actively concerned as individuals in stopping the socialist advance. I believe that this association's headquarters might furnish us the names of members who would faithfully keep the Dan Smoot Report displayed in their waiting rooms, just as fast as we could find the money for the subscriptions. I think that with the proper organizational follow-up, we might soon have a lot of these physicians and surgeons paying for subscriptions themselves. And I think that a great deal could be done through this association and its 15,000 members once they found out we had strength and meant business. For a further illustration, I think that both Human Events and American Opinion, which complement each other very well, should be put in barbershops from which we obtained firm written promises to welcome these publications and keep them on the reading tables just as fast and extensively as we could find the money. Incidentally, Human Events not only feels also that we complement each other well, but for this reason is willing to join us in offering bulk subscriptions to the two periodicals together at a reduced price. And American Opinion is, to the best of my knowledge, the first and only magazine with which they have been willing to join in such a combination offer. We should have such bulk combination subscriptions taken by business firms for our executives and some or all of their salaried employees as widely as possible and again as rapidly as possible. With the metropolitan press and big circulation general periodicals not only largely denied to us, but in many cases either consciously or blindly promoting the communist line, we need to use every feasible channel to get more of the truth over to more of the American people. And expanding the reach of the publications I have mentioned is just one of many ways of doing it. Also, there is another major and entirely different way of expanding their reach, which I have not even touched on here because I feel we have given enough time to this subject. 3. We would do everything we could to support, maintain, increase the number of stations used, and widen the audiences of such radio programs as those of Fulton Lewis, Clarence Mannion, and dozens of more localized broadcasters throughout the country. This would take the form of encouraging sponsors by both patronage of their products and letters of approval, of praising stations and networks for carrying such programs to offset the constant barrage of complaints and pressures they get from the left wing, of getting together groups to hear such broadcasts and inviting to those groups the uninformed or mildly interested who might be made active workers in the cause, by helping to raise money when absolutely necessary to keep such programs on present stations or get them on more, and in many other ways. In Springfield, Massachusetts, there is a radio commentator named Hubert Kregelow, who also teaches at one of the local junior colleges, and also, incidentally, is one of the associate editors of American Opinion. A few years ago, he was probably the most popular news commentator in western Massachusetts on television as well as radio. He is a solidly conservative, strongly anti-communist analyst of the news. The left wing succeeded in running him off the TV screens for good by organized and detailed pressures on his sponsors of almost unbelievable rottenness. They then went to work to get him off radio by pressure on both his sponsors and the radio station WSPR. It worked to the point that he has not had a sponsor for 3 years, and the radio station management has made it clear that they wish they could get rid of him. But 3 years ago, a group of patriotic citizens in the Springfield area organized what they call the Committee for American Treatment of the News. Without any tax exemption to help them, they have raised the money every year to pay him the necessary minimum for his services and to pay outright for his radio time, 15 minutes every weekday. So Hubert Kregelow is not only still on WSPR and not only has an excellent following, but I believe the influence of his program and his following may have been a main factor in causing that mealy-mouthed, quote, modern Republican, unquote, Congressman John Heselton to decide not to run again after several terms in Congress. Now, what was done in Springfield can be done by local groups in a great many other places in the United States if they are given examples of success elsewhere, encouragement, inspiration, and guidance. What is even better is that in some of these cases, at least, we should be able to help to find commercial sponsors for such broadcasters and to make the sponsorship a paying proposition so that they would not think of dropping the program. We would thus permit that same anti-communist money to be used for other purposes. To this end, direction and coordination would be extremely important. Of course, we should also get commentators and programs favorable to our cause on television, as soon as and to whatever extent we could. But despite the grandiose plans I am outlining here, gentlemen, I am still trying to be as practical and realistic with regard to what I think is actually possible of achievement as I can. I know the fantastic cost of television programs, so let me point out that I do not think any early extensive use of television by us would be either a wise utilization of resources against other possibilities, nor even necessary. For television is a quick and powerful medium, but its separate impacts are glancing blows of little depth, compared, let us say, to that of a great book, which can be read again and again, and which leaves an indelible impression and resolution in the mind. Also, television is tuned to and aimed at the masses. Now, up to this point anyway, the masses of America, as distinguished from the opinion molders, and despite all the brainwashing that has been attempted so far, the masses are still instinctively with us in opposition to communism. How much longer this will be so in the continued current course of events, it is hard to say. But at the present time, it is far more important for us to try to reverse the direction of the molding of the opinions of men who read and think and study and are themselves opinion molders, and for us to try to make going along with the communists less opportunistically attractive to leaders of little conscience than it is for us to beat our brains out in too hurried and too ambitious a direct attack on a mass wall we cannot budge. We have to reach and rebuild this wall of mass opinion in time, of course, because it has already been eroded by and yielded too much to the philosophy of collectivism and welfarism. But it is still a bulwark on our side of the front in the more immediate war against the communist conspiracy. And our best bet is simply to try to keep it from being eroded further, which leads us naturally into another step of this concerted program. It is still a prosaic step, against one or two that are somewhat more dramatic to be suggested presently. But the communists miss absolutely no bets or channels, and neither should we miss any that are in our practicable reach. So, 4. We would institute the organized planning and control to make full and effectively coordinated use of the powerful letter-writing weapon that lies so ready at hand. The communists boast that they can now land 50,000 individually written letters in Washington on either side of any subject within 72 hours. Actually, that is not too startling an accomplishment. We could make it look like peanuts with the million truly dedicated and controlled supporters who constitute the hypothesis, though merely an hypothesis, of this part of this discussion. There should be a continuous, overwhelming flood of letters, not just to legislators or the executive departments in Washington, but to newspapers, editors, television and radio sponsors, educators, lecturers, state legislators and politicians, foundation heads, and everybody else whose opinions, actions, and decisions count for anything in the ultimate total actions and decisions. Such an outpouring of mail would give more courage to a lot of people who would prefer to be more clearly on our side, and would at least slow down the brazen advance of some of those on the other side. Let me give you an illustration. A few months ago, United Airlines started a movement which could have had tremendous psychological and propaganda value for the internationalist left-wingers by putting the insignia of the United Nations on their planes with the words, quote, "We believe," unquote, under the insignia. And in this case, a spontaneous letter-writing campaign with the only organization or inspiration of the campaign coming without any coordination whatsoever from a few small right-wing groups and individuals, was able to force United Airlines to back down completely and publicly admit that they had made a mistake. This in itself would have been significant enough, but there was one angle to it, completely unpublicized, which made the results more striking. This was that United Airlines backed down and took the UN insignia off their planes, despite the fact that Paul Hoffman, Gardner Cowles, and Eric Johnson are all members of United Airlines Board of Directors. This shows what letter writing can do, even against determined and entrenched opposition. Also, there would be an advantage in continuous organized letter-writing campaigns of an entirely different nature. It would give the members of our local chapters and volunteer groups just one more activity, one more thing to do, by which they knew they were accomplishing something and being effective for the cause. For this very reason, among others, the letter-writing of subgroups should not be left to the haphazard or half-hearted following by the members of hopeful pleas or suggestions. It should be definitely planned, directed, and the amount of promptness of participation constantly checked and evaluated by a central headquarters or director. The biggest of all organizational mistakes is to set up a local group for some continuing purpose, exhort them to do a good job, and then leave them alone to do it. It is the leadership that is most demanding, most exacting of its followers, not the one which asks the least and is afraid to ask more, that achieves really dedicated support. We are presupposing here an initial faith and dedication which should be constantly strengthened by a man's straining effort to live up to what is expected of him and to live up to the promise he has made to himself. Letter writing of a different order of planned continuity and volume than anything attempted before, except on a somewhat more sporadic scale by the communists themselves. Letter writing of the kind that builds opinion exactly the way single grains of sand build a whole barricade. This is only one, but a still important one, of the disciplined activities by which we would keep 1,000,000 men working every day, adding small increments of strength to the anti-communist side for every bit of the time and energy they could devote to the cause. 5. We would organize fronts, little fronts, big fronts, temporary fronts, permanent fronts, all kinds of fronts. One of the greatest weaknesses and mistakes on the conservative side has been that almost all of the organizations, real ones or just letterhead outfits, have been put together for general purposes. The communists have been far smarter. They would never think of setting up publicly, for instance, a committee to promote communism. It is too general. Yet we have several leagues against communism and others just as vague in the fronts they present. The most effective fronts on either side are ad hoc committees aimed to accomplish or at least publicize one particular purpose. The communists have some long-range fronts, large, permanent, adequately staffed, of which the Committee for Aid to Foreign-Born is probably the oldest, largest, and strongest. But they have or have had hundreds of such fronts as the Committee for Clemency for the Rosenbergs, or the Committee to Publicize the Report of the Seven Ministers, which had no permanence, no staff, and frequently no organization except on the letterhead. Some one or more communists had simply been assigned the job of getting the necessary names and putting on that particular show, or of getting some gullible non-communist to do so. Now, on our side, probably the most effective of all the organizations has been the Committee of 1,000,000, devoted specifically to the job of keeping Red China out of the United Nations. It has helped a great deal in keeping Red China out so far, and, as is true in the case of all good fronts, well run, its influence has spilled over helpfully in many ways. We have some smaller fronts, such as ORFIT, an organization for repeal of the income tax, which have probably accomplished more in proportion to the money and effort spent than many of the larger organizations of conservatives, for it had and has a specific named purpose. But on our side, we are surfeited with organizations which have the general purpose of fighting communism, or the general purpose of promoting free enterprise, or of preserving constitutional government. Some of them have done a lot of good. They will never stop the communists, however, and they are not examples of the use of the front technique. Of course, fronts alone aren't going to stop the communists either, but enough of them being constantly organized for this purpose, that purpose, and every kind of purpose, some fading out and new ones coming in all of the time, can bother the communists, can occasionally put them on the defensive, can bring more of the uninformed and previously indifferent but patriotic Americans into the fight, and can help our cause in many ways. Again, let me try to make my point clearer and to make it more easily by suggesting a few examples. A. Committee for Withdrawal of Recognition. This is one we would set up as soon as possible. A permanent, adequately staffed front, actively engaged in mobilizing, publicizing, and guiding so as to make effective all possible sentiment for withdrawal of diplomatic recognition from Russia and the satellite governments. This committee would keep up a constant expounding and repetition about the reasons for withdrawal, and it would be able to find enough supporters, both individuals and organizations, which the press could not entirely ignore, to get at least some worthwhile free publicity from papers which would prefer to ignore it. B. An example of fronts at the other extreme as to size and permanence, which we would set up, might be a committee to protest the firing of Medford Evans. And gentlemen, don't be afraid of long names for these fronts. Such names, showing exactly what the committee is for, help to bring onto the letterheads and into the role of active supporters a great many people who would take no interest whatsoever in an activity of a more general nature and with a more vague description, even as ably directed a one as the Campaign for the 48 States. Now, the communists and their allies and dupes are always shouting about academic freedom. They have arranged several nationally publicized tantrums in educational circles when college professors with communist records have been dismissed, but they have been quietly causing professors who oppose the communist line to be eased out of jobs wherever they can. They have made it hard for such conservatives to get jobs, and they have used this pressure and threat unhesitatingly to make anti-communist professors who are still on faculties tone down their anti-communism or abandon the fight altogether. Now, Medford Evans is being fired. Officially, he has been told that his contract will not be renewed next June from Northwestern State College in Louisiana for no other reason than his uncompromising stand against communism. This can be shown conclusively to the satisfaction of any reasonable man, even a college professor. A bow to Dr. Oliver. In fact, as of now, the leftists behind this deal, apparently making a puppet out of the weak-kneed college president, seem to want it known that Dr. Evans is losing his job because of his anti-communism, again as a warning and threat to others like him. It is a long story in which some of the left-wing forces at Harvard seem to be definitely involved, and I'll not go into the details. But Medford Evans' scholarship is unquestioned. He is an excellent and popular teacher, as shown by the enrollment in his classes, and he is a fairly well-known writer for conservative publications. Also, he has friends both inside and outside of academic circles all over the United States. The president of the college has shown by both actions and words that he feels himself on very unsure and awkward grounds in carrying out orders or yielding to pressures which come from others than himself. I believe that if Medford were willing, and especially if we had the letter-writing strength available as referred to above to support such a front, a committee to protest the firing of Medford Evans could attract enough support to make quite a cause célèbre out of the affair, to make this small college and its smaller president look sick, and to throw quite a scare into some others contemplating doing the same thing. A few similar actions would slow down some of the brazen squeezing out of conservatives from teaching jobs and give new courage to those that remain. The front business, like a lot of techniques the communists use, can be made to cut both ways, and we would not have to be worried about their greater numbers smothering us either. We are talking about 1 million men, by which of course I mean men, women, and girls and boys of college age are old enough to be in the fight. And while nobody realizes better than I do the tremendous work and strain and dedication on the part of increasing numbers that will be required to recruit such an army, they are there just waiting to be recruited if we can get the story to them. And I hope to convince you tomorrow that my plans and thinking on this score are at least just as realistic as is any other conceivable undertaking by which we might save ourselves from communist enslavement. We already know that the whole job is of Herculean proportions, but so must be our efforts. So please let me proceed on my hypothesis for the time being. And the communists do not have 1 million men to work with in this country, even including their fellow travelers and active dupes. For some non-communist sounding United Front efforts, in which communist participation is not easily recognizable, it is estimated that they can muster just about 1 million useful workers. But for fronts with a visible communist slant, the reservoir they have to draw from is far less than that. It isn't numbers we have to worry about in this connection, but the courage on the part of our followers to stick their necks out and play rough, the same as the communists do all of the time, and that courage will come too with gathering strength. With such fronts as a petition to impeach Earl Warren, and I think we could get the names of 100 outstanding leaders from the South and many from the North on the letterhead right now. A committee to investigate communist influences at Vassar College, headed by Vassar graduates, of course, and Women Against Labor Union Hoodlumism, which would pick up the individual stories of husbands injured, cars wrecked, houses damaged, families terrified in the strike at Kohler and others like it, tell those stories from the women's point of view and show the suffering they caused wives and mothers. With these and dozens of new fronts popping up to attack the communists, or persons, institutions, and movements giving aid and comfort to the communists, We can certainly keep this whole front operation from being so one-sided as it has been. We can stop letting the communists have the whole effective use of this weapon practically by default, and what's more, we can use the noise and turmoil to help to wake up a lot of people to the fact that there is a deadly fight going on of which they had been blissfully unaware. C. A part of the same operation is the gathering of petitions, local petitions, national petitions, dealing with political matters, economic matters, educational matters, and everything under the sun. This is something else for the local workers to do, which, in its cumulative effect, is of considerable importance, and which would utilize the available time and energy of such local workers in a way which not only would be worthwhile, but which they could sense was worthwhile, if the planning and use of these petitions were thought out and carried through with sufficient care. Right now, for instance, a petition to the Airplane Pilots Association to grow up might find a very responsive reception. I am sure it would with you gentlemen, with both major airlines which serve Indianapolis now on strike. As the preamble to this petition would point out in the friendliest possible language in which such a charge could be stated, here is a group of men, all professionally trained, all well paid, and all in responsible jobs of a level to make them admired by the public, who by the union tactics of their association are bringing themselves down in the eyes of the public to the level of one of John L. Lewis's mine workers locals. These men must have the professional competence of and considerably more knowledge than the ship captains of older days. They should have the same respect for themselves and retain and enjoy the same respect from the public, not deliberately put themselves in the same category as chauffeurs and truck drivers, no matter how admirable and how necessary to our economy chauffeurs and truck drivers may be. It is obvious that some strong left-wing influences have seen a good strategic opening and have crept into the Airplane Pilots Association in considerable strength, and it is unlikely that any such petition would cause them to be dislodged. Also, the petition would undoubtedly be resented by most of the members, even those opposed to the strikes in which they participate, or the strikes of other airline employees which they support. But the petition, with perhaps 100,000 signatures, even while they resented it, would make these members sit up and take stock of themselves, of their association, and of the way it is being run. It would start a lot of people to thinking about the proper place of unionism in our lives and about the important part our present commercial airline pilots would play in any future war and the significance of left-wing influences so busily at work in that area. It also well might, as a more direct result, force those left-wing influences to be considerably more circumspect and cautious for quite a while. Let's take one more example from the opposite end of the drawer. The time will almost certainly come when that postponed next summit conference will again be brought to the fore. At such a conference in 1959 or 1960, when Eisenhower will have the noisy backing from a far more leftist Congress than we have ever had before, for even more drastic appeasement of and surrender to the communists, the blow to any remaining free world morale might well be final and fatal. Just as soon as the wind of such a forthcoming summit conference started to blow, we would launch the gathering of one of the most gigantic petitions of all times. My present feeling is that we should pick up Alfred Kohlberg's brilliant line and head this petition simply as follows: Please, Mr. President, don't go. It is just possible that we could get 10 million signatures and stop him from going, no matter how strong had been the original intentions of his advisers. And what a blow to the continued communist parade of success that would be. But the possible use of petitions is fairly obvious. Goodness knows the communists have proved their subtle value and effectiveness. We ought to outdo the communists at least 2-1 at that game until we finally make petitions so overabundant and commonplace that they cease, for a while at least, to be a useful technique for either them or ourselves. So let's go on to another step. 6. Another thing we should do, and one badly needed, would be to start shocking the American people, or an increasing percentage of the more literate and more intelligent who have not yet been completely brainwashed, into a realization of what is happening, into a dawning realization of how far and how completely communists and communist influences have crept right into communities, institutions, and activities where the general public does not have the slightest suspicion of such infiltration. The best way to do this is by exposure, which is why the communists just had to get rid of McCarthy and went to such extreme lengths to do so. No committee we might set up, of course, would have the subpoena privileges or other congressional powers of McCarthy, which makes our job far more difficult. And it would, for a while anyway, be vain to count on either of the remaining investigating committees of the House or the Senate. Their files are already bulging with important evidence about individual communists which has not been used and is unlikely to be used. The communist political pressures have become so strong and so devastating, and the Supreme Court's decisions have so hamstrung the actions of these committees that they hardly dare even go through the motions of hearings of this kind anymore. But, admitting the difficulties, some really dramatic exposures would be worth a lot. And it is because we must have a medium of publication for a lot of things which the regular press would at present be unwilling to touch that I have put so much work into American Opinion, have seen the magazine as such a necessity, and cannot help coming back to it just briefly here. We could count on some help from the other reputable right-wing publications, of course, because goodness knows we should be and would be helping them enough. But a medium which is not subject to the editorial ideas or the financial and personal considerations of anybody else is a necessity, and getting its readership and reach large enough for it to pack a noticeable wallop is also a necessity. For an article exposing some public figure as a communist in a magazine reaching 5,000 subscribers, even though many of them were quite influential, could and probably would be ignored by the communists, and the effect of the article would be smothered by this energetic looking the other way. But if the same thing were in a magazine reaching 200,000 subscribers, ignoring the charges would be out of the question. So please allow me to make a circulation of 1 to 200,000 for American Opinion a part of my hypothesis for the minute, and go on with this question of administering some shocks to the public. Let's make what we are talking about clearer by an illustration. There is the head of one of the great educational institutions in the East, not Harvard incidentally, whom at least some of us believe to be a communist. Even with $100,000 to hire sleuths to keep him and his present contacts under constant surveillance for a while, and to retrace every detail of his past history, I doubt if we could prove it on him. But with just $5,000 to pay for the proper amount of careful research, which could be an entirely logical expenditure and undertaking of the magazine, I believe we could get all the material needed for quite a shock. Of course, we would have to satisfy ourselves completely as to whether our guess had been correct from the preliminary research before going ahead with the project and spending that much money. But if we are right, and with the research job done and the material assembled which I think would be available, we would run in the magazine an article consisting entirely of questions to this man, which would be devastating in their implications. The question technique, when skillfully used in this way, is mean and dirty. But the communists we are after are meaner and dirtier, and too slippery for you to put your finger on them in the ordinary way, no matter how much they look and act like prosperous members of the local Rotary Club. Now, such an article might still be pretty much ignored by the general press, no matter how large our circulation. And, of course, we would be smeared by the liberals in every way they could contrive. But next to a woman scorned, hell hath no fury like that of a liberal about whom, or whose heroes, somebody has told the truth. But the smearing we would have to expect in due course anyway, no matter what we did. And the article, even if by delayed action, would have a powerful impact. A lot of the very people who joined in the smears would begin to wonder. Some of them would go back and read the article a second time. Others, never having read it but hearing about it, would get a copy and do so. The softening process of wonder and doubt at work on the resistant minds of these liberals and on the simply uninformed minds of some of the general public would be getting those minds in condition for the next shock and then the next one to penetrate further. For what would make this particular initial and sample shock such a bombshell is, first, the extreme importance of this man in other fields besides education. And second, that almost nobody, except some of those on the same side with him, of course, suspects the guy. It was only a very minor but a very strange incident that happened to turn my surprised eyes a few years ago to watching what he said and did against this possibility. But once you do just that long enough, there is less and less room left for doubt about his real purposes and accomplishments. Yet this man has on his board and administrative committees some of the ablest and most patriotic of Americans. Even a suggestion that he was a communist, if that suggestion were backed up by enough details and facts to make it obviously worthy of consideration by any fair-minded man, would come as an absolute blockbuster in a lot of circles besides the world of education. Incidentally, as I indicated just now in passing, one of the hardest things for the ordinary decent American to realize is that a secret communist looks and acts just like anybody else, only more so, or that anybody he, the ordinary decent American, happens to know personally could possibly be a communist. Due to the fact that I was for 2 years chairman of the Educational Advisory Committee of the NAM and came in contact with leading educators all over the United States, I have known the man under discussion for years, and he is, for all outward purposes, one of the nicest men you ever met. Most of them are. Now, what I have in mind, naturally, is following up one such bombshell with others. We might use this technique of complete articles in the form of questions addressed to important figures in various divisions of our national life, whom almost nobody now suspects, in one issue of the magazine after another. We might call it our question series, and get a lot of people looking for the question article each time. It should go without saying that we would have to be sure enough of our own ground in each case to satisfy the most exacting sense of fairness. But I believe the whole series could have the desired effect of shocking a lot of people into a reluctant awareness of what goes on, even many of those who would resent and smear the articles most severely at first. McCarthy had in his camp, before he got through, a lot of the people who had smeared him most bitterly in the beginning, including that newspaper in Syracuse. As for the number of deserving and sufficiently important targets for the arrows of our series, gentlemen, don't let that problem cause you a second thought. Highly placed secret communists, or at least workers for the communist cause, is something with which we are absolutely loaded. And while proving that any one of them is or ever has been an actual communist might be too difficult or even impossible, proving that the same man is a worker for the communist cause is a matter of the painstaking accumulation of a tremendous number of details, and then of selecting, merging, and compressing until you have the proper amount of material that yields the greatest explosive power per page. And there's another important reason for embarking on these exposures besides those that might first occur to you. Let's creep up on it by analogy for a clearer view. At the time of Pearl Harbor, and in the early years thereafter, it would have been absolutely fatal to Franklin D. Roosevelt and George Catlett Marshall for the part they had played in bringing on that catastrophe to have become known to the American people. By coercion on the one hand and rewards on the other, Roosevelt contrived to have perjury, postponements, decisions against the evidence, and every necessary means used before or in connection with one hearing after another to keep the truth from getting into the record. He refused to allow the court-martials demanded by General Short and Admiral Kimmel, to which they were clearly entitled, and he wrecked other service careers brutally and without hesitation to keep the real facts covered up. For the real facts not only constituted plain, unadulterated treason on the part of both Marshall and himself, but they would unquestionably have been so regarded at that time by a horrified American public. Exposure at that time might have brought Roosevelt's impeachment despite the war, and would certainly have been disastrous to the reputations and future careers of both Marshall and himself. But now notice that less than 10 years later, through publication of the books by Morgenstern, Kimmel, Admiral Theobald, and others, the true facts concerning Pearl Harbor were definitely established and made available for anybody who wanted to read them. And by this time, so far had effective public opinion in America been gradually eased towards the internationalist left, the Roosevelt worshippers didn't challenge the facts at all. They took the position instead of practically admitting the facts and of openly praising Roosevelt for having been so far-sighted and such a courageous statesmen as to have used this means of getting a united America wholeheartedly into the war, a war which was then prosecuted to such a glorious success on behalf of the future happiness of the world under Soviet socialist leadership as to make the loss of lives and ships at Pearl Harbor appear now as a picayune loss and a brilliant gambit. Well, gentlemen, I can assure you that the communists and pro-communists in Washington today, including those most highly placed, fully expect the same whitewashing of their deeds by the history resulting from those deeds. Right under our noses, the communists are gradually carrying out their plan of grand strategy, as already described, which is so to change the economic and political structure of the United States that it can be comfortably merged with Soviet Russia in a one-world socialist government. In this patient process, they never expect you to be able to find the line, or for there ever even to be a line, on one side of which you can say clearly that the United States is an independent nation, and on the other side of which you would know that the United States was already just another Soviet People's Republic in the worldwide communist empire, with the police state features already closing in on us. But somewhere we reach the point, if the communists are successful, as they now certainly expect to be, where all newspapers, all magazines, all radio and television commentators, all lecturers, and all historians will be constantly proclaiming the glories of this great one-world socialist government, which has now brought peace, meaning subjection and slavery, to all mankind. Already, through their stooges like Milovan Djilas, who is supposed to be in disgrace in Yugoslavia, and Boris Pasternak, who is supposed to be suffering bitter enmity of the dictators in Russia, but whose books have thus been publicized, and please note, helped by the left wing, to become bestsellers in America, already through such books which gullible Americans more readily swallow as true because of the supposed hatred of the authors for their respective governments, tens of thousands of opinion-molding Americans are more and more accepting, or finding less unbelievable, the thesis of these books that communism itself is all right, in fact is a glorious system, and that all that's wrong with it is the character of the people now running the system. Already, in hundreds of other ways, the communists are rubbing out or making more and more shadowy the lines of disagreement and the once sharp differences between our ways and theirs. The movement is smooth, widespread, continuous, insidious, and powerful. Already communism and communists, even with a record like Oppenheimer's, become more and more respectable in this country, and outspoken or firmly uncompromising anti-communists become more and more disparaged as fanatics. And so already it becomes less and less reprehensible for an American to be working for communism, especially if he labels it international socialism, even though he commits treason to the United States in doing so. The top American secret communists in this country, therefore, fully expect that by the time it is ever possible for anybody to bring out the fact that they have been working as secret communists, instead of that action then being considered as having been reprehensible, they will be praised for having, in courageous, far-sighted, and statesmanlike manner, helped to speed progress and the wave of the future. Instead of having committed treason to the United States, they will have been carrying out a deeper and superior loyalty to an all-encompassing one-world ideal which included the United States. They know that the moral judgments of the future belong to the victors, and they are confident that the agreed-upon legend which becomes history will be written by themselves and their supporters. They are well aware of the thought which Sir John Harington expressed, quote, "For if it prosper, none dare call it treason," unquote. Increasingly, as we near that stage, therefore, exposure of secret American communists will mean less and less. Again, we see why destruction of McCarthy took precedence over everything else on the communist American agenda. For he was exposing treason while it was still treason, and when it really hurt their cause. Whereas if they could only hold off such exposures for a few more years, bringing out the same facts and exposing the same men would not amount to anything serious anyway. Which brings us back to the step we are supposed to be discussing of our own exposure through publication of present secret communists, while it will still shock the American people and can have some real effectiveness. It would at the present time, for the important consideration would be to do these things and bring out these facts before the communists were ready for them. If we do not start beating them to the punch on a lot of things, we are gone anyway. Of course, we would have to be prepared from the beginning for a lot of smearing, as I have already said, and possibly also, no matter how carefully our job was done, for a lot of nuisance libel suits. And we must face the fact that our courts have by no means been immune to communist infiltration either, so that if the supposedly aggrieved parties could get their cases into certain courts, the libel suits might easily prove to have more than nuisance value. But it is to be remembered that libel suits also necessarily give added publicity to the charges, which is one thing we would be seeking and which the left would be most anxious to avoid. Also, admittedly, the step proposed here is drastic, but this is no cream puff war we are in, and the stakes involved are not those of a pillow fight. We have to face squarely up to the solid truth that unless we are willing to take drastic steps, a lot of them, and very drastic indeed, we haven't a chance in the world of saving our lives, our country, or our civilization. And we might as well start reconciling ourselves to having our children, not just our grandchildren, live under the Kremlin's rule as Mr. Khrushchev indirectly prophesied. 7. The sequence of these steps means nothing except just the way I happen to be listing them. But this one is closely connected in purport to the one above. To keep from wearing you out completely, however, I'll cover it far more briefly. There are now dozens of slimy characters at loose in our midst, whom I'll call to your attention by describing one who is more or less typical. His usual name is Gordon Hall, though he also uses and has used many aliases. He and his fellow toilers for the communist cause all follow the pattern more elaborately established by their more spectacularly successful archetype, Avidus Bogus Darunian, otherwise known as John Roy Carlson, author of the libelous book Undercover, which viciously smeared many good American patriots and sold several 100,000 copies. In fact, Gordon Hall worked for a few months for the same outfit that financed John Roy Carlson into fame. This was the so-called Friends of Democracy, run by Rex Stout, former editor of the communist publication New Masses, and by the so-called Reverend L.M. Burkhead. Gordon Hall was employed by them for the same purpose as had been Carlson, namely to pose as a violent anti-Semitic and pass out anti-Semitic literature to outspoken patriots. Then, wherever he could find one nibbling at his bait, to follow it up, encourage the man's incipient anti-Semitism or his susceptibility to the virus, and eventually to work the victim into a position where, under the prodding of his friend Carlson or Hall, he said something or did something which could be exhibited as evidence of his anti-Semitism. From then on, he was sure to be smeared sooner or later by the outfit for whom Carlson or Hall were gathering this information as fascist, anti-Semitic, and generally a rotten character in every way. Now, it is true that any man who ever listened to these whisperings of hatred from Carlson or Hall was foolish or worse. But a dislike for other races or creeds is a kind of unfortunate weakness to which human nature has a sad and too general vulnerability. It has been used by the communists with tremendous energy, skill, and determination in America to stir up hatred and distrust among innocent people between Gentiles and Jews, of Protestants for Catholics and vice versa, of white people for colored and of our colored citizens for their white neighbors, and in a dozen lesser ways and opportunities. It's a rotten game, but the man who falls for it is not half as rotten as the man who promotes it, and most rotten of all is the agent provocateur, who stirs up this hatred specifically for the purpose of being able to accuse others of having yielded to it. Now, this Gordon Hall I am supposed to be talking about, if I can keep from being carried away by my subject, has plenty of other unsavory stretches in his record. But he is very much at large, puts on a very respectable front, and is quietly but busily moving around making speeches somewhere almost every night, to church clubs, PTA groups, and similar small local audiences. And what he spews is subtle but deadly poison, carefully flavored to appeal to each different group in each different locality. He has recently been working New England, which is why I am using him for a sample. He begins, of course, by announcing that he is vigorously opposed to communism and communists, but we mustn't allow our fear of communism, which is little practical basis anyway, to cause us to listen to people who, in fighting communism, will do more damage to our ideals and our quote, democracy, unquote, and our wonderful American feeling of, quote, brotherhood, unquote, than would the communists themselves. And he then proceeds to make clear that these dangerous, detestable people include practically everybody who has ever opened his mouth against communism. In western Massachusetts, for instance, we have several hundred subscribers to American Opinion due to the fact that Hubert Craigelo, the radio commentator on station WSPR, of whom I told you earlier, is a regular contributor to our magazine and frequently mentions it on his broadcasts. So, to a PTA audience of some 200 in Springfield, Gordon Hall, after taking only a careful crack or two at Craigelo himself, because Craigelo was likely to have friends in the audience, then went on, quote, regretfully, unquote, to make clear that his strongest real criticism of Craigelo was that Craigelo unfortunately had now got himself tied up with and was working for a real hate group in Boston headed by Robert Welch. And he left no doubt that this Robert Welch in Boston was promoting hatred for all minority groups and especially for those who believed in democracy and brotherhood and social progress, or that anybody who read my magazine ought to be ashamed of having such hatred-promoting trash in his possession. Gordon Hall then came to Boston and made several speeches, in which he never mentioned my name or let on that he had ever heard of me. For if he had even implied to one of these audiences that I was anti-Semitic or anti-Catholic or anti-Negro or anti-anything else except communists, or even in general terms that I was running a hate group, the chances are somebody would have got up and called him a liar, as he well knew. But he sawed plenty of wood just the same, and he is plenty smooth. One result of one of Gordon Hall's appearances in Boston would have been amusing but for its confirmation of the widespread impression he was creating so successfully. By the time he got through with this particular audience of good church members, he had them believing exactly what I told you in my first paragraph about him above, namely that the real danger was not communism but the bigotry and intolerance of the anti-communists. I know because a close friend of our family who heard him, and she is as fine a woman and as patriotic an American as you will ever meet, took it on herself shortly thereafter to give me something of a lecture on my attitude towards the communists. She said this attitude was perhaps too harsh and probably unfair to some people who were merely progressive, and her lecture was based, as she proudly informed me, on what she had recently learned from a wonderful speaker named Gordon Hall, who was himself strongly anti-communist, however, because he had said so several times in his speech. Now, as I pointed out in the beginning of this section, there are many of these birds racing around over the country, actually promoting communism by making the task of the anti-communist more difficult every night. And we could silence them with comparative ease. All it would take in Gordon Hall's case would be to send about 3 people to his lectures, but a different 3 each night, have them sit apart and show no connection with each other, and let each of them ask a question during his question and answer period. Quote, Mr. Hall, according to this printed record, you once spent several months passing out anti-Semitic literature. Is that true? Unquote. As soon as he finishes squirming out of this one, another question arises. Quote, Mr. Hall, according to this announcement of your speech, obviously based on information you yourself gave the program chairman, you worked for a while for the XYZ agency. But I have here a published statement I happened to run across in which Mr. X says that you never worked for the XYZ agency at all or in any capacity. Is Mr. X mistaken? Unquote. For a speaker like Gordon Hall, before the kind of audiences which employ him, it is quite difficult to refuse to allow a question and answer period. Let the barrage indicated above go on for a few nights during that period, and Gordon Hall may still be finding some other way to serve communist purposes, but it will not be as a speaker and probably not half as effective in its results. Stopping the damage done by speakers like Gordon Hall is not really too hard if anybody cares, but there, as in so many other ways and activities, we are simply letting the communists win by default. 8. We would line up a large list of speakers ourselves all over the country, and there are plenty available, who would be willing to speak to these comparatively small audiences for small fees or no fees, not on communism or anti-communism in general, but on specific subjects, who could make speeches which thus would be informative and well received, but which could still carry a strong anti-communist message. This, like everything else we are talking about, is a matter of planning, supervising, and control. Then we would go to work putting together the huge lists of church clubs, PTA groups, and others who use such speakers, and start making known to them who was available on what subjects. Most of the speakers' bureaus and lecture agencies are not utilized by such groups to any great extent because neither side can afford it, which leaves the doors wide open for the communists to send in their men or their friends. It's another game at which we ought to beat them hands down. 9. Now this is certainly not intended to be a comprehensive list. If so, it would last for days. Not only have we barely started on the measures that need to be taken energetically and promptly, when it comes to the number and variety of activities through which the communists are ceaselessly working, we have hardly scratched the surface by the countermeasures suggested. But we have to be practical, and so, regretfully, I'm going to skip any discussion of other actions, classifiable and non-classifiable, defensive and offensive, which leap to mind except for the two major categories of effort which complete this series. And those two I'll merely outline or indicate because anything approaching proper coverage of either would take entirely too long. Ninth and current in this listing, therefore, would be our undertakings on the international front. For many reasons, we would start extending our body into other countries as soon as there were energy and resources which could properly be spared for that purpose. And please note that I said body, not organization. There is a huge difference, as I hope to make clear in the morning. An organization is a collection of individuals or groups held together more or less loosely and more or less temporarily by a common interest or common objective. A body, in the sense I am using it, because it is the closest I can find to a word to express my concept, is an organic entity. The Americans for Democratic Action is an organization. The Catholic Church is a body. The Republican Party is an organization. The Communist Party is a body which can move and work and make itself effective as an entity. We shall return to this whole thought and its importance in the morning. Let's leave it now that we would have our body grow across national boundaries as soon as we properly could. In the meantime, other worthwhile goals would be the setting up, or helping to set up, one by one and very carefully, governments in exile out of the most respected and solidly anti-communist refugees from the satellite nations. Or, if in some instances there were no refugee leader available in this country, with sufficient prestige and acceptability among his own people back home to justify his being made the head of a government in exile, we could serve the same purpose in those cases by establishing, quote, revolutionary committees, unquote. If these leaders could be given or helped to obtain the core of an organization, and please note that in connection with anything political, organization is the right word, then those governments in exile or revolutionary committees could put new courage into the hearts of millions behind the Iron Curtain. They are millions whose despair, largely brought about by the actions of our government over the past several years, is today one of the greatest assets of the communist conspiracy. Such governments in exile would also be rallying points for a far more energetic opposition to communist maneuvers and propaganda in this country on the part of refugees who have become almost fatally frightened and discouraged since 1953. 10. Finally, and probably most important of all these courses of action, we would put our weight into the political scales in this country just as fast and far as we could. For unless we can eventually and in time reverse by political action the gradual surrender of the United States to communism, the ultimate alternative of reversal by military uprising is fearful to contemplate. Now there is one thing to which any intelligent patriotic American might as well make up his mind at once. This is that the thorough and painstaking organization and work at the precinct level, which wins elections, is not going to be done and can't be done by the Republican Party. It can be done in one state under the personal leadership and management of a Barry Goldwater for his own campaign. It might have been done in California by Bill Nolan if he could have got himself disconnected from his, quote, modern Republican, unquote, duties as minority leader of the Senate in time, and if he had known what he was up against. But it cannot be done nationally by the present Republican Party, nor by anything that can come out of the present shattered Republican Party in the foreseeable future. And it cannot be accomplished through the leadership, drives, and loyalty-inspiring qualities of any candidate for the presidency, because there simply isn't time between the conventions and the elections. This doesn't mean that the Republican Party cannot win elections, including possibly the next presidential election. Please understand. It does mean that, especially if the Republican Party then stands nationally for any Americanist principles whatsoever, it cannot win unless it has strong help and backing from forces outside of the straight political organization, such as the Democratic Party has on the other side in Walter Reuther's Committee on Political Education. In my opinion, not even the Democratic Party, which for all of its bitter internal splits remains a far more disciplined and unified organization for campaign purposes than the Republican Party, can carry out any such precinct activities precisely directed at a national aim. There are too many local candidates and local issues for its precinct leaders and their bosses to think about, which is why the most effective work toward one clearly definite national goal and policy is now being done by Rufus Cope. And the Democrats are winning elections because he picks up so many of their candidates, and they are the beneficiaries of his tremendous organizational reach and resources. We are at a stage, gentlemen, where the only sure political victories are achieved by non-political organization, by organization which has a surer, more positive, and more permanent purpose than the immediate political goals that are only means to an end, by organization which has a backbone and cohesiveness and strength and definiteness of direction which are impossible for the old-style political party organization. It is to be noted, and is extremely important, that the AFL-CIO under Walter Reuther's increasing domination is gradually being converted from an organization to a body, in the senses I have distinguished above. We would have to move into this field, gentlemen, with a body of our own. What's more, we would have to move ahead of Reuther in strength that can be applied to this purpose as rapidly as possible. Nobody knows, and there is no way of finding out, how many millions of dollars Reuther spent in the last election, nor how many tens of thousands of precinct workers he was able to put on the job. But with 1 million men and the resources consistent with the dedication of those men, which we are presupposing, we could move in on the elections thereafter with both more manpower and more resources than Reuther will be able to marshal by that time. Fantastic? Of course it's fantastic. But everything I am talking is fantastic. We are living in fantastic times and a fantastic situation. The alternative to sufficiently fantastic measures and efforts is a fate of fantastic suffering for our children and the equally fantastic loss of a whole humane civilization that has cost countless sacrifices, immeasurable labor, and an infinite number of noble dreams across the centuries in the building. We are in circumstances where it is realistic to be fantastic. I was careful to bring into this group only men of sufficient intelligence and imagination to understand that paradox. And tomorrow morning I hope to make the realism of this afternoon's hypothesis and these proposals at least as believable as is the almost unbelievable present power of the forces of evil arrayed against us. May you have a good dinner, a little surcease from such serious thoughts, and a good night's sleep in the meantime.